In our last two installments, we looked at the development of modern sci-fi, which has been relatively easy to define as a genre. Aliens, experiments, and inventions following the course of the world we know into the near and distant futures. But the other two genres we've been tracking here, fantasy and horror, are much harder to define apart from one another. So there's bound to be a lot of overlap and blurring. Maybe the simplest way to begin is to draw a distinction between light fantasy and dark fantasy. The first is heroic, optimistic, and painted in bright colors, and the second is full of despair, doubt, and failure. While the roots of modern SF may go back to works like Frankenstein, many of the Gothic novels of the 18th and 19th centuries were more closely akin to fantasy, and we recently looked at works like William Morris's The Well at the World's End from 1896, which included familiar elements like a medieval setting, night, quep, deep forests, and supernatural creatures. But while these works tended toward the melodramatic atmosphere of the Romantic period, by the early 20th century, we begin to see more humorous and satirical fantasies like James Branch Cabell's Jurgen, which was published in 1919. Its hero is a medieval rogue who goes on a quest to find and rescue his wife, whom he more or less wants to have back. He winds up visiting several imaginary worlds and meeting figures out of legend, like Merlin and the Muses. He also has affairs with all of the women he meets, and he wins a debate with the devil himself. Each episode in the book is unconnected with the others, which places Jurgen in the tradition of earlier satirical adventurers like Cervantes' Don Quixote and Voltaire's Candide, whose heroes aren't especially capable or even noble, but do try to do the right thing. The first modern fantasy stories, like the first sci-fi stories, appeared in the pulp magazines of the 1920s and 30s. While amazing stories focused on sci-fi, others like Weird Tales, which first appeared in 1922, focused mainly on fantasy and horror. But while the sci-fi of the time might contain elements of the other two genres, in practice they were much more intertwined with one another. The weird fiction of that era included disturbing and violent fantasies like Robert E. Howard's Conan stories, which were filled with monsters, battles, and women in distress, unlike the kind of high fantasy we find in Tolkien, where noble heroes must test their limits in order to save the world. These stories, which became the model for what's now called sword and sorcery, also tend to be dark. The protagonists of sword and sorcery stories are more often anti-heroes who are seeking to gain vengeance, become rich, or just survive in a harsh reality. Horror also blended with fantasy in some of the work of H.P. Lovecraft, such as his Dreamland stories, which are set in another dimension entered only through dreams, and where there are lands inhabited by various peoples, including non-human creatures, as well as castles, magic, God, and quest. The magazine Weird Tales also included some stories which had a very different tone from the darkness and violence of Howard and Lovecraft. These stories blended fantasy and the detective story. The writer Seabury Quinn, for example, published tales of the detective Jules de Grandin, who, like Carl Kolchak on the 1970 show The Night Stalker, and Mulder and Scully on The X-Files, solved cases involving supernatural beings, which sometimes turned out to be not supernatural at all. Robert Howard and H.P. Lovecraft were friends of a third writer, the poet Clark Ashton Smith, who wrote many fantasy stories during the early 1930s. Like Lovecraft, Smith's stories are filled with death, decay, and physical corruption. They're set in a number of places. Two of these are the ancient lands of Hyperborea and Atlantis, the sort of places that Howard set his own stories. But one of his settings, Zothique, is millions of years in the future, when the sun is dying and the world's other continents have sunk under the ocean. The idea that the distant future might be a world of quests, magic, and strange creatures, which more closely resembles medieval fantasies than it does our conventional visions of the future, would appear again in authors like Jack Vance, who started writing his Dying Earth series in the 1950s. And in movies like Ralph Bakshi's 1977 film Wizards, in which magical creatures live among the remnants of our world millions of years after a nuclear war. In addition to weird tales, there was a magazine called Unknown, edited by John Campbell, who also edited the SF magazine Astounding. Unknown specialized in more whimsical, satirical, and humorous stories, like Horace Gould's Trouble with Water, about a New York salesman named Greenberg who goes fishing and gets into a fight with a water gnome. The gnome curses Greenberg by making water avoid him, which has very unfortunate results. Unknown also published the first story in Fritz Leiber's series about the traveling adventurers and sometime heroes called Thafford and the Grey Mouser, who come across as real people rather than ideal archetypes and don't always do the right thing. In another series of stories by L. Sprague DeCamp, magic exists, but it follows mathematical principles which can be used to travel to the worlds of various traditional mythologies. Another DeCamp story was Lest Darkness Fall, about a man who was magically transported from present-day Rome to a time not long after the fall of the Roman Empire. Like the hero of Mark Twain's Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, he puts to good use his knowledge of future technology, though his immediate goal, like Harry Seldon in Asimov's Foundation series, is to stave off the Dark Ages that he knows are about to arrive. DeCamp also wrote a series of stories in the 1950s which were inspired by Howard Conan's stories, in which adventurers travel through many lands in a time before recorded history, but they're set in the time of the last ice age, around 15,000 years ago, and the geography of DeCamp's world is based on the idea that the sea levels of that time were lower than they would later become. And though the stories contain magic, it is giving way to the technologies which historians associate with the historical Iron Age. While Campbell's two magazines, Unknown and Astounding, were dedicated to fantasy and SF respectively, the two genres have been combined since 1949 in the magazine Fantasy and Science Fiction, which has published stories about unicorns and magic spells on the one hand, and SF like A Canticle for Leibowitz and Flowers for Algernon on the other. The fantasy books, stories, movies, and TV shows of the 20th and 21st centuries have varied in tone between the brightness and absurdity of satirical novels like James Cobble's Jurgen and the more serious or darker tone of Gothic works like The Well at the World's End. Relatively few modern works of fantasy are played completely for laughs. The most obvious of these is Monty Python and the Holy Grail, which lampoons traditional fantasy tropes like knights, castles, duels, and virtuous maidens. We might also mention some of the work of Douglas Adams, like his Dirk Gently detective series, which combines SF elements like robots and time machines with ghosts and the gods of the Norse pantheon. More recent is Matt Groening's Disenchantment, which pokes at traditional fairy tale themes and values. Its hero is a princess who likes to drink and doesn't even try to fit the traditional mold. The world of fairy tales and its tropes are also exploded by The Princess Bride, which is framed as a story read by a grandfather to his sick grandson. A less absurdist, but still satirical fantasy is Shrek, which is set in the same kind of pseudo-medieval world. There are also more contemporary comic fantasies, like Pushing Daisies, a candy-colored series narrated like a fairy tale, whose hero discovers that he can bring dead people and things back to life, but only at the cost of some other life which happens to be in the neighborhood. Though the result may be morbid, it isn't dark. And the same is true of the 2000 show Dead Like Me, in which the business of death is farmed out to a bunch of on-the-job trainees who help the disoriented newly deceased to find their way to the next world, but spend most of their time sitting in a booth at a Waffle House called Der Waffle House, grousing about their lives and needling each other. Some of the brightest fantasies are set to music. One of the first of these, from 1939, is The Wizard of Oz. Like L. Frank Baum's original books, the film version falls squarely into the category of fantasy, with one exception. The wizard himself turns out to be a snake oil salesman from Kansas who's using machinery to pose as a supernatural being. Oz is mostly a light, bright world, and all of the movie's songs are either happy, like Follow the Yellow Brick Road, or wistful, like Under the Rainbow, one of the most moving songs of the 20th century. But at the same time, the Wicked Witch, her soldiers, and her flying monkeys introduce a darker element. From 1946, we have Song of the South, which combines the post-Civil War plantation setting of the Uncle Remus character with animated versions of the stories he tells to children. The 1960s and 70s gave us movies like Bedknobs and Broomsticks and Mary Poppins, which also combined live action with animation or stop-motion photography. There have also been entirely live-action musical fantasies, like Chitty Chitty Bang Bang from 1968 and Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory from 1971, in which the Oompa Loompas sing a song explaining why each of the children has met their unfortunate fate. Disney stock in trade was, for a very long time, animated musical fantasies, from Snow White to Frozen. These are all centered around existing or newly written plots, but Disney's purest fusion of music and animation is Fantasia from 1940, in which the music is at the center and the tone is much grander and sometimes darker than the company's usual productions. Some of our comic fantasies also have a noticeably dark streak, which goes back to satirical adventures like Voltaire's novel Candide. Nowadays, this sort of fantasy is typified by the director Terry Gilliam, as in his Brazil, which combines the absurd world of a pointless and smothering bureaucracy with people who happily beat, torture, and execute anyone who turns up on their list of work assignments. In Gilliam's Adventures of Baron Munchausen, Wonderfully Ridiculous Things, A Visit to the Moon, people running across continents and riding on cannonballs, happen against a background of war and death, at a time which the movie ironically calls the Age of Reason, and Death himself is present as a character throughout the film. Finally, in Gilliam's Time Bandits, we have a group of low-level employees of the Supreme Being who try to enrich themselves by exploiting some of the more terrible and destructive events of history, only to be captured by Evil himself, who wants to remake the entire universe in his image. Toward the end of the movie, which maintains a comic tone, lots of people from across time are brutally killed, and the parents of the hero, a young boy, are blown to smithereens, and it's made clear that we are all pawns in the hands of higher powers who don't much care about what happens to us. A similar combination of the absurd, the comic, and the dark suffuses the work of Terry Pratchett. Though his Discworld novels draw on familiar sources of fantasy, like fairy tales and the sword and sorcery tradition, they also satirize many of the terrible truths of the real world: corruption in politics and business, bigotry, and the tyranny of the powerful over the weak. Here, too, death is a constant presence, and it's up to ordinary people to act the best they can under the circumstances. Pratchett, along with Neil Gaiman, also wrote the 1990 novel Good Omens, about two longtime acquaintances, an angel and a demon, who work together to prevent the end of the world by interfering with the upbringing of a boy who is supposed to become the Antichrist, so that he will instead turn into a regular adult who is neither entirely good nor entirely bad. They aren't motivated by a sense of ethics or responsibility. They just don't want to give up the pleasures of living on the earth, where they've been stationed since the beginning of time. In the end, the ultimate fight is not between good and evil, but between fallible people and the supernatural forces that are ready to wipe them out in the course of their battle for supremacy. A particularly bright form of fantasy became common on American television during the 1960s and 70s, when a variety of sitcoms with bizarre premises were produced. Like the sci-fi shows of that period, such as Star Trek, they were made up of self-contained episodes, but each show was built on an unlikely premise. Two of the most famous examples are Bewitched, about a good wit who has become a suburban homemaker and must deal with the wacky problems caused by her abilities and her magical friends and relatives, and I Dream of Jeannie, about an astronaut who must deal with the wacky problems caused by the genie he has accidentally released from her bottle and her magical friends and relatives. Then there was The Munsters, about a Frankenstein-type monster and his suburban family of vampires and werewolves and the wacky problems they get into while trying to live normal lives, and The Addams Family, about a suburban family of odd people and creatures and the wacky problems they get into while trying to live normal lives. One of the first of these shows was My Favorite Martian, which could be described as a sci-fi comedy that gave the title character all sorts of abilities like invisibility and telekinesis, which were natural to him rather than the product of some advanced technology. One of the most ridiculed of these shows was My Mother the Car, about a man who must deal with the wacky problems caused by his deceased mother, who has possessed his antique car and speaks to him through the radio. Then there was The Flying Nun. Though it had only a single element of fantasy, the nun of the title would regularly be lifted up into the air because she was thin and wore a large wimple on her head which would catch the wind. This was featured in every episode, often as a way of allowing the nun to reach people in need and help solve their problems. But alongside these shows were anthology programs like The Twilight Zone, which combined SF, fantasy, and horror. Its fantasy stories, which were written by the popular authors of the time, varied in tone. They could be fairly light, as in One for the Angels, in which an old man who sells cheap goods on the street draws the angel of death into a long sales pitch so that he won't have time to take the soul of a little girl who lives in his neighborhood. Here, death is impatient but ultimately sympathetic, and he eventually gives in to the old man's charms. Then there's The Man in the Bottle, another story about a genie, but in this case, he's a malevolent sort who grants a nice but unsuccessful older couple 3 wishes, each of which turns out to have unfortunate consequences. Next time, we'll finish by looking at some of the more serious themes of modern fantasy and at the many different settings in which it takes place: the distant past, other dimensions, the world of fairy tales, and even the post-apocalyptic future. Please remember to like and subscribe.